Welcome to On Contact. Today we discuss life in the world's largest concentration camp, Gaza, with author and scholar Norman Finkelstein.
When you ask where do we go, the Palestinians in Gaza answered that question for us. They said we're going to try nonviolent mass resistance. And one of the facts about that nonviolent mass resistance is it can't succeed without our support, any more than the African Americans in the South could have successfully brought about desegregation on their own.
Israel keeps 2 million Palestinians in Gaza trapped and surrounded in the world's largest concentration camp. It uses its military to shoot and wound unarmed protesters, destroy power plants, schools, medical clinics, apartment complexes, and hold villages. Robert Piper, the United Nations Coordinator for Humanitarian Aid and Development Activities, said in 2017 that Gaza had a long time ago passed the unlivability threshold. Youth unemployment is at 60%. Suicide is epidemic. Traditional social structures and mores are fracturing, with divorce rising from 2% to 40%, and girls and women increasingly being prostituted, something once seen only rarely in Gaza. 70% of the 2 million Gazans survive on humanitarian aid packages of sugar, rice, milk, and cooking oil. The UN estimates that 97% of Gaza's water is contaminated. Israel's destruction of Gaza's sewage treatment plant means raw sewage is pumped into the sea, contaminating the beach, one of the very few respites for a trapped population. The Israelis have not even spared Gaza's little zoo, slaughtering some 45 animals in the 2014 assault and leaving it a mangled ruin. Joining me in the studio to discuss Gaza and Israel's policy towards the Palestinians is the country's foremost scholar on the Israel-Palestine conflict, Professor Norman Finkelstein. His latest book is Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom. First of all, as somebody who comes out of the Middle East, I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I spent 7 years there. This is probably the most important book I've read on Gaza, hands down. I have a kind of emotional favorite, which is Joe Sacco's Footnotes in Gaza on the 1956 massacres, which the Fateful Triangle, but it is an extremely important work. And as somebody steeped in the Middle East, I can't stress enough how important what you've done is. What you do in the book, which I think is so important, is that from 1948 onwards, the Israeli treatment of the Palestinians fits a very identifiable pattern over and over and over and over. And you walk away from the book and it just implodes the Israeli propaganda and the Israeli lies, including this latest massacre, the 8th massacre since 2004. Talk about what that pattern is.
Well, I think the pattern is pretty straightforward. The pattern is Israel likes to say that Arabs only understand the language of force, and it's really a projection of their own mental outlook. They believe that the Arabs in general and Palestinians in particular only understand the language of force. And so when it comes to Arabs in general and Palestinians in particular, the Israelis have only one tool in the box, and the tool in the box is to inflict massive death and destruction to put the population in line. There's really only one signal.
But it doesn't work. I mean, as you point out in 56, they went into Gaza and killed hundreds, especially in Han Yunis and other places. I mean, this has just been, and they are quite open about disproportionate force, which means lethal force against unarmed civilians. In the case of Gaza, they were literally lining up people against the walls and gunning them down. And yet, 50 years of this, it's not worked.
Well, I don't really agree with that. I think it has worked. Israel has managed to sustain the occupation of the West Bank and of Gaza for a half century. There are periodic moments of resistance by Gaza. Israel then, as it says, it goes in and mows the lawn.
Right.
The consequences for Israel are relatively minor, trivial, you might say, and then Gaza stays quiet for several years, and a pattern has developed where whenever the Gazans or the natives become restless again, Israel goes in to mow the lawn. So I think we shouldn't be too sanguine about a people's power to resist.
Let me just throw in there, because I think a lot of people on the outside, when they hear about it, the refugee crisis, don't understand that in order to create the Jewish state, there had to be an expulsion. There were, 1 million Palestinians in Palestine. If they weren't expelled, the Jews would have been a minority within their own state.
Right, well, that's the, it's not what you would call a radical opinion. The Israeli historian Denny Morris, he writes in his expanded version of his book, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Question. The expanded version is revisited. He says that the idea of transfer, and transfer is just a euphemism for ethnic cleansing, the idea of transfer was inbuilt and inherent in the idea of Zionism. For the reasons that you just spelled out, it was impossible to create a overwhelmingly Jewish state in an area which at the time was overwhelmingly Palestinian Arab.
And which since the 7th century had been Muslim.
Yeah, without carrying out a mass expulsion. And so the process which culminated this past month, it begins literally almost to the day 70 years ago, when several 100,000 Palestinians who were expelled from the area that became Israel went to Gaza, fled to Gaza, or were driven to Gaza. And now about 70% of the population of Gaza is classified as refugees. So the first layer of this process was the expulsion. Then the second layer begins approximately a half century ago in 1967, when Israel occupies Gaza. It was from the beginning a very brutal occupation. Most of the atrocities were presided over by Ariel Sharon. And as you already mentioned, those atrocities were already anticipated in 1956 during the British, French, Israeli...
When we talk about atrocities, we're talking about wholesale executions.
Yeah, as you say, the process began in 1956 during the British, French, Israeli tripartite invasion of Egypt. Israel invaded Sinai, Israel invaded Sinai and Gaza in the process, and in November 1956 carried out mass atrocities in Rafah and Khan Yunis. After the occupation officially begins in 1967, in order to pacify the population, Israel then carried out fresh atrocities presided over by Ariel Sharon. So the second layer is a brutal occupation.
I want to talk in detail about the blockade, but we're about to come on the break. Before we do, just explain a little bit about Hamas. So they win the election. There actually is an attempted Israeli-backed coup against them, but just talk about who Hamas is.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hamas stands for the Islamic movement, and it was formed in the 1980s. To some extent, it was formed with Israeli support indirectly Israel took a kind of hands-off approach to Hamas.
I was there. So what it meant is they wouldn't strike Hamas leaders because they saw Hamas as a way to create, to fragment the power of Fatah, Arafat's Fatah.
They wanted to create a counterweight, a conservative counterweight to the secular nationalist movement. And so they indirectly encouraged the creation of Hamas. And I would say during the first Intifada, Hamas was, in my opinion, it was a nuisance factor because it refused to go along in many instances with what was called the Unified National Command, the secular organization.
This was the first uprising by the Palestinians, nonviolent, largely they threw rocks, but nonviolent.
It was overwhelmingly nonviolent. It was Gene, what's his name?
Sharp.
Yeah, Gene Sharp estimated at the time that it was 85% nonviolent. And the violence consisted, I was in the occupied territories, living there during the first Intifada. It consisted of little kids throwing stones, and the stones never even reached the soldiers. There's only one soldier who was killed by a stone. It wasn't a stone, actually. It was a boulder which was thrown from the top of a building on a soldier. That was it. And the burning tires, which was the other symbol of the first Intifada, was, as I said, it was symbolic. It had no practical significance.
When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Norman Finkelstein about Israel and Gaza. Welcome back to our conversation about Gaza and Israel's policy towards the Palestinians with author and scholar, Professor Norman Finkelstein. So 2006.
2006, the Palestinian people had grown wary of their quote-unquote representation in what was then called the Palestinian Authority. There was the factor of the widespread...
Can I just interject there? Because I think you make an extremely important point in the book, that the Oslo Agreement, you argue, I think in hindsight, of course, you're correct, was really about the creation of a Palestinian Quisling class, i.e. the Palestinian Authority, that was willing to do the bidding of Israel.
Yeah, there's all sorts of misunderstandings about the process that has unfolded there. The Oslo process was extremely successful.
This was the peace agreement orchestrated, quote-unquote peace agreement orchestrated by Clinton that allowed Arafat to come back from Tunisia.
It was a calculation that you can turn what was called then the Palestine Liberation Organization, you can turn it into subcontractors to enable Israel to free its hands from doing the dirty work in Gaza, which had gotten it very bad PR during the first Intifada. And secondly, because Israel likes to prepare its army to fight big regional wars, and here the army had gotten bogged down in the occupied territories in what was basically police actions, chasing kids in the Nablus Kasbah. And so they wanted to replace the Israeli troops with an indigenous force. The PLO at that point was shortly after the first Gulf War, where it made the strategic or tactical error of lending support to Saddam Hussein. And as a result of that, the Gulf states cut off all their money to the PLO. They basically subsidized it, the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, and so forth. And so the PLO was broke, and Arafat, without money, was like a fish without water. He needed the money in order. It was a patronage operation.
Right.
If you do our bidding, we'll keep you alive, or keep you a going operation. And now Arafat, he had a certain kind of nationalist residue in him. And I can imagine easily that in his mind, he thought that he was going to outsmart the Israelis and the Americans, that he was going to accept the offer, but he thought he was very cagey and very clever, which he was not. He was rather stupid.
Right.
and he thought he was going to be able to outsmart them. But the others behind him had no such nationalist residue.
But they were just crooks.
They were just crooks.
Well, you know, I got to Gaza, and the PLO had come, and they were all driving tax-free Mercedes and building villas on the beach. I want to move to 2006. So Hamas is elected, and then explain the siege and how draconian, because the siege is part of the instrument. The other instrument is a concerted effort on the part of Israel, not only to butcher civilians, as we recently saw, not protesting nonviolently, but also to use their military to destroy infrastructure. So talk about what's happened to Gaza, and I think last year was it Piper at the UN who said, Robert Piper, Gaza's become unlivable. So talk about what life has become like and why unarmed Palestinians are willing to go day after day and be killed in the scores, thousands wounded. Talk about that.
Well, as I said, the Palestinian people had grown weary of their so-called representatives, the Palestinian Authority. There were parliamentary elections in January 2006, which Jimmy Carter called completely honest and fair. They elected Hamas to power, not so much because they supported Hamas's political agenda, but because Hamas had a reputation for being relatively honest in its social institutions. There's a good book on that by Sarah Roy of Harvard. She wrote on the social institutions run by...
Which I saw. I mean, you go to camps like Khan Yunis, and that's how people ate.
Right. It did change. We have to be honest about that. They did grow corrupt when they came into power. But initially, they were a pretty honest outfit, relatively speaking. They were a pretty honest outfit. They had that reputation. And a large part of it was a protest vote against the Palestinian Authority. Immediately as they came into power, as immediately as they were elected, Israel slapped draconian sanctions on Gaza.
When we talk about sanctions, I mean the list of stuff that they prohibited. Yeah. Talk about, because this is...
Well, actually...
Children's toys, I think.
It makes more sense if you compose a list of what they allowed in, because there was so little that was not on the list of prohibited items. They prohibited all sorts of condiments. They prohibited chocolate. They prohibited baby chicks. They prohibited potato chips. It was quite an extraordinary list that they had assembled.
Cement.
Well, the cement is, you know, I, of course, would never justify it, but they could call it dual,
that's what they did. They
call it dual purpose. It can build homes, but it also can build, you know, tunnels. But it's very hard to comprehend how bonbons could be construed as a lethal weapon. The list was designed, as was perfectly clear, because the Israelis said it. We're going to reduce their caloric intake to a minimum so that they don't literally starve, but their caloric intake is just at the threshold of starvation. They said that. They calculated the number of calories each Gazan needed each day, and then calibrated the amount of food that got in to keeping them just above the level of starvation. And then you had the expulsion, you had the occupation, you had this brutal blockade, and then were the periodic massacres since 2004. That is to say, there have been 8 massacres in Gaza. The last one was the worst of the lot, Operation Protective Edge in 2014. And to give you some sense of the magnitude of the death and destruction that was inflicted on Gaza, Peter Maurer, who's the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Moorer's job description, apart from the administrative and bureaucratic tasks, his job description is basically to bear witness to war zones. So if you Google Peter Moorer, Afghanistan, he's been there. Peter Moorer, Iraq, he's been there. Syria, he's been there. Central African Republic, he's been there. Yemen, he's been there. And it was very striking, at any rate to me, that when he left Gaza after Operation Protective Edge, he went there.
But almost 2,500 Palestinians killed, 100,000 homes damaged or destroyed.
It's not just the numbers, because we've grown numbed by the numbers. It was his overall sense of what happened. He said, never before have I seen destruction on the magnitude that I saw in Gaza. Now, that's a quite extraordinary statement coming from an official who had been to Syria. He had been to Iraq. He had been to Afghanistan. Never before have I seen so much destruction as I saw in Gaza. So then you have the layer of massacre. And so it's unsurprising, I think, that by 2012, the UN began to issue a series of reports which began in the interrogative, will Gaza be livable in 2020? They answered, probably not. 2015, another UN agency, UNCTAD, puts out a report, and it's no longer in the interrogative, it's in the declarative. It says, on Gaza's present trajectory, it won't be livable in 2020. And then in 2017, Robert Piper of the UN, he said, we were optimistic. He said, Gaza has crossed the unlivability threshold a long time ago.
And I just want to close. So you have...
Wait, but what does that mean concretely? So let's just take one concrete example. 97% of the water in Gaza is contaminated. And what does that mean? That sounds still clinical. Well, then you turn to Sarah Roy from Harvard University, the world's leading authority on Gaza's economy. And in the new edition of her standard work, she writes, innocent people, most of them young, are slowly being poisoned by the water they drink. And so the bottom line for everybody listening is 2 million people, more than half of whom are children, are trapped in an unlivable space and are slowly being poisoned.
And you put it this way in the book. Do Palestinians have the right to symbolically resist slow death punctuated by periodic massacres, or is it incumbent upon them to lie down and die? This is the world's largest concentration camp. Mm-hmm. The whole fallacy that it's a border, it's not a border. It's an open-air prison. There's no border between Gaza and Israel, as you and others have pointed out. And we just have a few seconds left. Where do we go? What is our...
Bear in mind that when the paragraph or the sentence that you cite from me, I was speaking to their right to use mostly symbolic armed force like these rockets, which are really just enhanced fireworks. When you ask where do we go, the Palestinians in Gaza answered that question for us. They said we're going to try nonviolent mass resistance. And one of the facts about that nonviolent mass resistance is it can't succeed without our support, any more than the African Americans in the South could have successfully brought about desegregation on their own. They recognized early on in the South that in the absence of support in the North, and in particular from the federal government, that they were going to be ground under by the white racist system in the South, that they had to appeal to, arouse the conscience of, and eventually win the active engagement of the federal government to tell the Southern white power structure, enough is enough. And it's the same thing here. Left to their own devices, however nonviolent it is, Israel will mow them down. And as I said earlier, the violence will work. I'm not one of those who believes a just cause always works.
That was scholar Professor Norman Finkelstein, author of Gaza, An Inquest into Martyrdom.
Thank you.